In the last lecture, we talked about food webs and food chains, and now we're going to take those organisms and we're going to organize them on an ecological pyramid. Sometimes our ecological pyramid is going to be drawn like this, kind of in sections, but we can also draw an ecological pyramid just as a triangle divided into sections. It's the same thing. Now, each level or each section is called a trophic level, and the base, the bottom, would be considered the first trophic level. I'm just going to write TL to abbreviate. We're going to write trophic over there under a bullet. We could also call it the first feeding level. So I'm going to put FL there for feeding level. So we have the first trophic level, then we have the second trophic level, the third trophic level. I'm going to draw a fourth, and as you can see, we're getting smaller as we go up, so we're going to make this even skinnier than the third trophic level. And let's go ahead and label that the fourth trophic level. So again, trophic level and feeding level means the exact same thing. Now, the organisms that are going to be on the first trophic level are going to be your plants or your autotrophs. Auto means they can make their own food. So let's do autotrophs. And if we want to put in parentheses, plants, going to be on that first feeding level or trophic level. And then we've got the herbivores. And then we've got some primary carnivores. And then we'd have secondary carnivores. I can ask you to indicate what type of consumer would be on the second trophic level. So let's kind of practice doing that. So on that second trophic level, if you think about it, the plants are producers. So the organisms on that second trophic level would be called our primary, means first, our primary consumers. And then we would have our secondary consumers, and those would be our tertiary consumers. So on an assignment, you're going to have to identify the types of organisms that will be on the different trophic levels. Now, there is a reason why this has the shape of a pyramid. It's because the base is the biggest. And what they're trying to represent is three different ideas. More than anything, in an area, you are going to have more plants than you have herbivores, and more herbivores as you have carnivores. So this shape helps remind us that in the first feeding level, we're going to have the greatest number of organisms there, and those are going to be the plants in an ecosystem. Now, if you think about it, these plants, they have mass. And if we were to count the number of plants in an area and put all those plants in a pile, that would be a really big pile of plants. Okay, so let's indicate that if we gathered up all the plants in an area and put them in a pile, so let's put plants, that's going to be a huge pile. If we gathered up all the herbivores and put them in a pile, that pile would be much smaller and there's less of them. And then we would have an even smaller pile of the carnivores. Okay. Now, imagine if I took the plants, the herbivores, let's go ahead and label the carnivores and the herbivores. Carnivores, we wouldn't have very many of them, and our herbivores. If we dried out those piles, I would have still the biggest pile would be the plants. Now, when we take living tissue and we pull the water out, so we can do this with fruit. You know how like we can dehydrate fruit and you can eat it? What you're eating is called the biomass. The biomass is basically, after you take out the water, you're going to be left with proteins, carbs, lipids, and nucleic acids. We would still have the biggest pile, even after we remove all the water, is going to be the pile of plants. So in an ecosystem, the plants make up the greatest amount of biomass in that ecosystem. And in that biomass, they're storing energy. So if there's more biomass, more proteins, carbs, lipids, and nucleic acids, then that group of organisms is going to have the most energy stored in their tissues, in their biomass. So, more than anything, we find more energy stored in the tissues and molecules of our plants than we do herbivores and carnivores. You could also tell this by if you lit these three dried piles on fire, the biggest fire releasing the most energy is going to be this one with the plants. Okay, so there's more energy tied up in the molecules that plants are made out of compared to the herbivores and the carnivores. So, again, the fact that we're showing this as a triangle is just helping to demonstrate that you're always going to have the most energy stored. And as for the organisms and ecosystem, you're going to have more plants than you will your herbivores and then your upper level carnivores. So all trophic levels get smaller as you move up. And this is because of what's called the 10% energy transfer rule. To put that in perspective, is when you eat breakfast, let's say you eat 2 pounds of food, you're not going to be 2 pounds heavier tomorrow because some of that energy is going to be used and released. And only about 10% of the energy that you consume is actually going to be stored on you as you make new proteins, carbs, lipids, and nucleic acids using that energy. So the 10% energy transfer rule simply states that from the first trophic level, only about 10% of the energy from that trophic level actually makes it up into the herbivores. Only about 10% of the energy stored in the herbivores actually makes it up to those first level carnivores. And then only 10% of that energy makes it up to that fourth trophic level. Now, if you think about what your upper level carnivores are, like your wolves, your bears, your eagles, those don't die because something is killing them. Those organisms die because they can't find enough food. Because if you think about it, there's just not a lot of energy that is making it to those upper level carnivores. So their population is really controlled not by predators, but the availability of food. Now, if 10% of your energy gets stored, what happens to your other 90%? So let's demonstrate this with the caterpillar and the bird. So the caterpillar is going to be eaten by the bird. Only about 10 kilojoules, if that caterpillar has 100, only about 10 kilojoules of energy are actually going to be stored and are going to stay in the food chain. Because if a predator eats the bird, it would get those 10 kilojoules of stored energy. That bird is probably, I'm just going to say around 70%, around 70 kilojoules of the energy that the bird got from the caterpillar are going to be used. This bird's going to fly around. It has to use energy for its heart to beat. It has to use energy to maintain its body temperature. And then that energy gets converted into heat. And that heat gets lost from the bird and put into the environment. So that energy is gone from the food chain. Also, this bird isn't going to be able to digest every molecule in the caterpillar, and some of that energy is going to be lost as waste. And what would be left would be 20 kilojoules. So it's going to be lost. So let's indicate lost as waste. Okay, so only about 10% is getting stored. Okay, and the majority is being lost. Let's indicate this energy is being lost as heat and lost as waste. So that's what we're saying right here in this part. So energy can be lost due to waste because we do not digest and consume every part of most organisms. Like even if you think about, even if you're eating steak, you usually cut off some parts of it. There's some parts of it that's really hard for you to ingest, where it's difficult to chew. There are parts of animals that we don't eat because we just don't consume those parts, like antlers and hooves and bones. There's energy in them, but those are going to be discarded. So technically, that is waste. Energy can be used by organisms. So what we can break down and turn into energy, when we use that energy gets converted to heat. and gets released, and it's gone from the food chain of the food web. And only about 10% of the energy that we take in our food is actually stored on us and will stay in the food chain. And again, since only about 10% is making up to each trophic level, we have a limit to how many trophic levels we can have because of the low amounts of energy that are making it up to those upper level trophic levels or those upper level carnivores, making our total number of trophic levels limited. We usually only see about 4 or 5 trophic levels in an ecosystem. There's just not enough energy making it to the top to support 6 and 7 and 8, etc. And again, that is why if you see 1,000 herbivores in an area, you're only going to see about 10 lions, because only about 10% of the energy is going to make it up to those lions. So they can't support more than about 10. Now, in relation to humans, let's talk about what happens if we eat on the third trophic level. So I'm going to put third TL here for trophic level. So we are going to take plant material and feed it to a cow, and then we're going to consume some meat from the cow. So technically we're on that third trophic level. And if we directly eat something from the plant, okay, we would be on the second trophic level. So what is more efficient? How could we support more people on this planet? Should we be eating on the third trophic level or the second trophic level? Now, to put this in perspective, imagine if I sent you to a village and you needed to educate the villagers because they didn't know how to produce a lot of food. And so a lot of people in their village was starving. So you have to figure out what you're going to teach them so they can produce enough food to feed all the villagers. Let's say they have 10 acres of land. Would you teach them how to plant crops on the 10 acres and then collect the grain? Would you decide that they should turn half of it into pasture and put cattle there and then half of it to crops? Or do you think that they should turn all 10 acres into pasture for cattle, just raise cattle? Well, if you're trying to feed as many people as possible, then you will want to teach them how to take that land and turn it into crops and not waste any energy on cattle. So, for example, let's say you took this grain, let's say that's about 200 pounds. And over, maybe a few weeks, a couple months, you feed this to a cow. This cow is going to use some of that energy to build muscle and stores that energy in those proteins. But out of all that energy, I bet you that cow is only going to make about 2 pounds of meat that you can actually consume. I mean, some of this energy will go to growing hooves and growing hair and maintaining body temperature. Only about 2 pounds is actually going to be stored or into tissue that we consume. If we had taken 200 pounds of grain, okay, and let's say we're going to just grind it up into flour and we're going to turn that into bread. Now, I'm going to guess you could probably make about 400 loaves of bread with that grain. And think about how long would it take you to eat 400 loaves of bread? That would take you, months versus 2 pounds of meat. I would say you're going to be through that meat in about 2 days. Okay. So if you directly consume this plant material, and that means we're on the second trophic level, you're going to get all of that energy. If you take that energy and you first send it through an herbivore, then you got to remember that that cow is going to lose some as waste because it won't be able to digest all the parts of that seed. And it's going to use, so I'm going to write use, and then I'm going to write heat because that energy gets converted into heat energy and then it's going to be lost. And you only have access to a very small amount of that energy that was initially tied up in that grain. So it is more efficient for humans to eat from lower trophic levels. If you take that energy and you send it through an herbivore, they're going to use some of that energy and release it as heat. And they're also going to have some waste and make parts that we don't eat. And that's wasted energy. You're going to have less energy if you send it through that herbivore first.